What happens when prejudice and arrogance collide with unseen power at 30,000 feet? Two young, successful black twins, Jordan and Jaden, board a first-class flight, only to be targeted and humiliated by a flight attendant who decides they don't belong. She questions their tickets, mocks their clothes, and tries to throw them off the plane. But she makes one critical miscalculation. She has no idea who their father is. With the entire cabin watching, one of the twins makes a single, quiet phone call. Within minutes, the airline's entire global operation grinds to a halt, freezing every plane on every tarmac in the world. This isn't just a story of mistaken identity. It's the story of how one call from a powerful father unleashed a storm of karmic justice that an entire corporation would never forget. Before we begin, comment where you are watching from today, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now let's get into it. The scent of premium leather and subtle, expensive air freshener filled the first-class cabin of transatlantic air flight 715 from New York to London. For Jordan and Jaden Peterson, identical twins in their early 20s, it was a familiar environment. They had grown up with success, not as a birthright handed on a silver platter, but as a principle instilled by their father, Robert Peterson. He had taught them that wealth was a tool, not a trophy, and that character was the only currency that truly mattered. Today, they were flying to London to close a major expansion deal for their own burgeoning tech startup, a company they had built from the ground up with a seed loan from their father that they were already paying back with interest. They were dressed in their typical work attire, minimalist high-end streetwear. Jordan wore a charcoal gray designer hoodie, tailored black joggers, and a pair of pristine limited edition sneakers. Jaden's style was similar, a deep navy blue version of the same outfit. On their wrists they wore identical, understated but clearly valuable timepieces. They were the picture of modern, youthful success. As they stepped onto the plane and turned left into the exclusive cabin, they were met with the practiced yet chilly smile of a senior flight attendant. Her name tag read Karen Miller. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and a gaze that seemed to appraise and dismiss them in a single, sweeping motion. "May I see your boarding passes?" she asked, her voice a little too loud, her tone lacking the warmth she had just bestowed upon the older gentleman in a tailored suit who had boarded before them. "Of course," Jordan said, pulling out his phone and showing her the digital pass for seat 2A. Jaden followed suit with his for 2B. Karen squinted at the screens, her lips pursed. "These are first-class seats." The statement hung in the air, thick with insinuation. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Yes, we're aware," Jaden replied, his voice calm and even. He refused to let her blatant prejudice ruffle him. They had dealt with this before. The surprise, the skepticism, the subtle suggestion that they were in the wrong place. She took an unusually long time verifying the passes on her own device, tapping the screen with a manicured fingernail. It seems correct," she finally conceded, her tone suggesting the airline's computer system had somehow been compromised. "Your seats are just there." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the front row. As the twins moved to stow their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment, they became aware of another passenger, a portly man in his 60s with a florid face and a tweed jacket that looked a size too small. He was seated in 3C across the aisle. He watched them with undisguised contempt, muttering just loud enough for them to hear, "Well, there go the standards. They'll let anyone up here these days." Jordan's jaw tightened. Jaden placed a calming hand on his brother's arm. "Don't give them the reaction they want," the gesture said. They ignored the man and settled into their spacious pod seats. The seats were cocoons of luxury, offering privacy and comfort, but today they felt like a fishbowl. They could feel Karen Miller's eyes on them and the occasional scornful glance from the man in tweed, who had now introduced himself loudly to another passenger as Reginald Beaumont. Karen approached their seats again, this time with a pre-flight drink tray. She offered champagne and orange juice to every other passenger, making cheerful small talk. When she reached Jordan and Jaden, her smile vanished. "You two need anything?" she asked curtly, not even presenting the tray properly. "I'll have a glass of water, please," Jordan said politely. "Same for me," Jaden added. She returned a moment later, placing the glasses on their consoles with a little more force than necessary. As she walked away, Reginald Beaumont caught her eye and shook his head in performative disgust. Karen gave him a small conspiratorial smile in return. It was a silent, ugly alliance, a shared belief that the twins were imposters in their world. Jordan leaned over to his brother, keeping his voice low. "Can you believe this? We paid thousands of dollars for these tickets and we're being treated like stowaways." "I know," Jaden murmured back, his gaze fixed on the screen in front of him. "Just breathe. We're here to close the biggest deal of our lives. Don't let these ignorant people get in our heads. Once we're in the air, they'll leave us alone." But Jaden was wrong. The humiliation was only just beginning. The boarding process was nearly complete. The first-class cabin was full, a mix of business executives in suits and wealthy older couples. The atmosphere was supposed to be one of serene exclusivity, but a palpable tension had centered around seats 2A and 2B. Karen Miller was making it her personal mission to validate her suspicions about the Peterson twins. She approached their seats one more time, her face set in a mask of stern authority. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need to see your boarding passes and your identification again," she announced, her voice carrying across the quiet cabin. Heads turned, conversations paused. The quiet hum of the plane was replaced by an awkward silence as all eyes fell on the twins. Jordan sighed, a flicker of irritation finally breaking through his composed exterior. "We've already shown them to you. Is there a problem?" "There might be," Karen said, her chin jutting out. "We've had some issues recently with fraudulent upgrades and stolen reward points. I just need to perform my due diligence. It's for the security and comfort of all our passengers." She emphasized the word all, while looking pointedly at Reginald Beaumont, who nodded in solemn agreement. Reluctantly, Jordan and Jaden produced their phones and their driver's licenses. This was beyond standard procedure. This was targeted harassment. Karen took the licenses and stared at them, comparing the photos to their faces as if she were a detective trying to uncover a masterful disguise. "These names, Jordan and Jaden Peterson," she said slowly, reading them aloud as if the very sound was foreign. She handed them back. "I'm still not satisfied. The system can have glitches. I've seen it before." "Not satisfied with what?" Jaden challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. "With our legally purchased tickets? With our government-issued IDs? Or is it something else?" Karen's face flushed with anger. "Are you accusing me of something, young man? I'm the head purser on this flight, and I am responsible for everyone here. And you're doing a terrible job of making your passengers feel welcome," Jordan shot back, his patience finally snapping. Reginald Beaumont seized the opportunity to interject. Here, he boomed. "If they can't follow simple requests from the staff, perhaps they should be on a different flight, or a bus." A few other passengers tittered nervously. The twins were now completely isolated, put on trial in front of a jury of their supposed peers. "That's it," Karen declared, her eyes glinting with a triumphant malice. "You have a hostile attitude, and I don't feel comfortable with you on my flight." She pulled out her staff communication device. "I'm calling the ground manager. We're going to have you removed." Jordan and Jaden stared at her in disbelief. This had escalated from microaggressions to a full-blown public ejection. They were being accused of being hostile for simply defending their right to be there. A few minutes later, a harried-looking man in a rumpled airline suit came aboard. His name tag identified him as Frank Gable, the duty manager. He walked directly to Karen, completely ignoring the twins. "What's the problem, Karen?" he asked, his expression already weary. "These two," she said, pointing a finger. "They're being disruptive. I have doubts about the legitimacy of their tickets, and they've become aggressive. Mr. Beaumont here can attest to it." Frank Gable glanced at the well-dressed older white man, then at the two young black men in hoodies. He didn't need to hear another word. His mind was already made up. He turned to Jordan and Jaden, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "Sons, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane with me," he said, not as a request, but as an order. "We can sort this out back in the terminal." "Sort what out?" Jaden asked, standing up to his full height, which was just over 6 feet. "We have done nothing wrong. We are ticketed passengers in our assigned seats. Sir, if you don't cooperate, I will be forced to call airport security," Gable threatened, his voice rising. "Now, are you going to come quietly, or do we have to make this a bigger scene than it already is?" The cabin was dead silent. Everyone was watching, some with phones discreetly pointed in their direction. It was the ultimate humiliation, being treated like criminals, paraded off a plane they had every right to be on. Jordan looked at his brother, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and helplessness. They could argue, they could refuse, but it would only end with them in handcuffs. The system was rigged against them in this moment, embodied by the unholy trinity of Karen Miller, Reginald Beaumont, and Frank Gable. But they had one card left to play, an ace in the hole that none of them could ever see coming. A strange calm settled over Jaden. He had absorbed the prejudice, the condescension, and the outright hostility. He had played the game, trying to de-escalate, to be the bigger person. But now they had been pushed into a corner, with their dignity and their character publicly assailed. The time for quiet compliance was over. He looked Frank Gable directly in the eye. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it resonated with an unnerving, icy authority that cut through the tension in the cabin. "You are all making a monumental mistake," he said slowly and deliberately. "One you will regret before this plane ever pushes back from the gate." Karen Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. "Is that a threat? You hear that, Frank? Now he's threatening us." Frank Gable crossed his arms. "Son, the only mistake here is you not getting off this aircraft immediately. Last chance, security is on its way." Jaden simply held up a hand, a universal sign to wait. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his sleek, top-of-the-line smartphone. His movements were fluid and unhurried. He wasn't panicking. He was executing a maneuver. He swiped through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a single entry for a moment before pressing it. The contact simply read, "Dad." He put the phone to his ear. As it rang, he turned his back slightly to the gawking passengers, affording himself a sliver of privacy. He looked out the small airplane window at the bustling tarmac below, at the other transatlantic air jets being loaded and prepped for their journeys across the globe. The call connected. "Hey, Dad," Jaden said, his voice now devoid of any confrontation. It was the calm, casual tone of a son calling his father. "Sorry to bother you. I know you're busy." There was a pause as he listened. "Jordan and I are fine, but we've run into a bit of a situation." He paused again, his eyes scanning the faces of his accusers. Karen looked smug. Gable looked impatient. Beaumont looked bored, as if swatting a fly. "We're on transatlantic air, flight 715 at JFK. We're in our seats 2A and 2B. The flight crew and the ground manager are refusing to honor our tickets. They're trying to remove us from the plane. They're claiming we're being hostile, and that our first-class tickets might be fraudulent." He listened for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence in the cabin was so complete that the faint, muffled voice on the other end of the line was almost audible. "Yes, Dad. That's what I said. Transatlantic air," Jaden confirmed. "Okay, I understand. We'll wait." He hung up. The entire call had lasted no more than 45 seconds. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to face Gable. He and Jordan retook their seats. "We're not going anywhere," he stated simply. Frank Gable's face turned crimson with rage. "You think a little call to your daddy is going to change anything? Who is he, the mayor? I'm calling security right now. You've had your chance." He reached for his radio, his thumb pressing the button to speak. But before he could utter a word, a different sound filled the air. It was the captain's voice, crackling over the plane's intercom system, not with the usual cheerful welcome, but with a note of clear confusion. "Folks, this is your captain speaking from the flight deck. We seem to be experiencing a slight, an unforeseen operational issue on the ground. We're being told to hold our position at the gate. We'll let you know more as soon as we have information. Please remain seated." Karen and Frank exchanged a puzzled look. This was unscheduled. Jordan looked at his twin, a single question in his eyes. Jaden gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his face a mask of calm. They would wait. The call had been made. The gears were now in motion. For the first 5 minutes, it was merely an inconvenience. Passengers sighed, checked their watches, and went back to their phones and magazines. Delays were a part of air travel. But then 5 minutes stretched into 10. The captain came on the intercom again, his voice now strained with genuine bewilderment. "Ladies and gentlemen, an update from the flight deck. We've just been informed of a system-wide network outage affecting all of Transatlantic Air's operations. Our ground logistics, booking, and communication platforms are all offline. We're being told no transatlantic air flight anywhere in the world is being cleared for departure. We are effectively grounded. We have no further information at this time." A wave of murmurs and anxious chatter swept through the entire plane, from first class to the last row of economy. On the tarmac outside, the usual ballet of baggage carts and fueling trucks had ceased around every plane bearing the airline's livery. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and turned the entire multi-billion-dollar global airline off. In the first-class cabin, Frank Gable's radio, which he had been about to use to call security, suddenly squawked to life. It wasn't a calm, procedural call. It was a panicked voice from the Central Operations Tower. "All station managers, what the hell is going on? Our entire network just went dark. Nothing is working. We can't check passengers in, we can't track flights, we can't push a single plane back. Is this a cyber attack?" Frank's face went pale. This was no ordinary delay. This was a catastrophe, a corporate nightmare of unprecedented scale. His personal problem with 2 passengers in 2A and 2B was suddenly dwarfed by a crisis that was costing the airline millions of dollars with every passing second. His corporate-issued phone began to ring, vibrating violently in his hand. The caller ID displayed a name that made his blood run cold. Howard Davies, CEO. He fumbled with the phone, his hand shaking. Hello? Mr. Davies?" he stammered. The voice on the other end was not the calm, commanding tone of a chief executive. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. "Gable, what did you do?" Frank was stunned into silence. "Sir, I don't understand. The whole system is down." "I know the whole system is down," Davies screamed, his voice distorting through the phone's tiny speaker. "I just got off the phone with Robert Peterson. Do you know who that is, Gable? Do you?" The name sounds familiar, sir," Frank mumbled, his mind racing. Familiar? He's the CEO of AuraSync Technologies, the company that designed, built, and manages our entire global logistics and operations software. The multi-million-dollar system that is currently black, and he says he shut it down himself. The color drained completely from Frank Gable's face. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Karen Miller, standing beside him, had overheard the CEO shouting and looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Reginald Beaumont, who had been enjoying the show, now looked deeply uncomfortable. "Why, Gable?" the CEO continued to yell. "Why would our most critical technology partner personally deactivate our entire airline? He told me it was because employees on Flight 715 at JFK were attempting to unlawfully eject his sons from the aircraft. He called it a fundamental breach of service contract. Now you tell me, Gable, what is going on in the first-class cabin of that plane right now?" Frank's eyes darted towards Jordan and Jaden Peterson. They were sitting quietly, watching him, their expressions neutral. The name, Peterson. His mind finally made the terrifying connection. He was no longer dealing with 2 young men in hoodies. He was dealing with the sons of the man who held the keys to their entire kingdom. The man who had just turned the lights off on their whole world with a single command. The call wasn't to a lawyer or a politician. It was a call to the system's architect, the god in the machine. "Sir," Frank croaked, his voice barely a whisper. I think I've made a terrible mistake." The revelation descended upon the first-class cabin like a physical weight. The CEO's voice, though muffled, had been loud enough for those nearby to hear key, terrifying phrases. Robert Peterson. Shut it down himself. His sons. Karen Miller staggered back a step, her hand flying to her mouth. Her carefully constructed world of petty authority and prejudice had just been vaporized. She looked at the twins, Jordan and Jaden, and for the first time, she didn't see two young men who didn't belong. She saw the heirs to a technological empire, the sons of the man who had just brought a global airline to its knees on their behalf. Reginald Beaumont, who had been so smug and vocal, now seemed to be actively trying to merge with the upholstery of his seat, his florid face a sickly shade of gray. He avoided all eye contact, staring intently at a spot on the floor as if it held the secrets to the universe. The story was devastatingly simple. Robert Peterson, the founder and CEO of AuraSync Technologies, was a self-made billionaire, a titan of the tech industry. He was also a fiercely protective father. When his company, AuraSync, had signed the 9-figure deal to overhaul Transatlantic Air's archaic digital infrastructure, his team of lawyers had included several bespoke clauses in the contract. One of them, buried deep in the legal text, pertained to the guarantee of service. It stipulated that if the airline failed to provide the contracted service to any representative or immediate family member of AuraSync's executive board for reasons deemed discriminatory or without legal cause, AuraSync reserved the right to suspend all software services immediately to prevent further brand damage by association. It was a clause no one at the airline ever thought would be invoked. It was a nuclear option, a doomsday switch. But Robert Peterson had just pressed it. He hadn't hacked the system. He had legally and contractually turned it off. On the phone, CEO Howard Davies was still laying waste to Frank Gable's career. "You had one job, Gable. Ensure a smooth departure. Instead, you and one of your power-tripping flight attendants decided to humiliate the sons of our most vital business partner. Do you have any idea what this is costing us? We're looking at 9 figures in losses if we stay grounded for even an hour. The stock will plummet. Heads will roll, Gable, and yours will be the first." "Mr. Davies, I can fix this," Frank pleaded, desperation cracking his voice. "I'll apologize. We'll do whatever it takes." "You will do more than apologize," Davies bellowed. "You will get down on your hands and knees and beg for their forgiveness. You will offer them anything they want. A private jet, a lifetime supply of champagne, your firstborn child, I don't care. Just get Robert Peterson to turn my airline back on. The board is calling me, the press is calling me. The world thinks we've been hit by a hostile state actor, but it turns out the call is coming from inside the house, thanks to you. Fix it. Now." The line went dead. Frank Gable stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear. The silence that followed was deafening. He slowly lowered the phone and turned, his entire posture transformed. The blustering, officious manager was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man. He and Karen Miller exchanged a look of pure dread. They were no longer in control. They were defendants in a trial where the verdict had already been delivered. With trembling legs, Frank Gable took a step towards Jordan and Jaden Peterson. Karen followed a half-step behind, wringing her hands, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara. The power dynamic in the cabin had not just shifted. It had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. The humiliated had become the powerful, and the tormentors were now the ones who had to beg. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin of Flight 715 had undergone a chilling transformation. The initial sense of a juicy, dramatic spectacle, 2 upstart youths being put in their place, had curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. The other passengers were no longer spectators at a show. They were hostages in a crisis of someone else's making. The CEO's enraged voice, bellowing through Frank Gable's phone, had been a thunderclap of reality. Every passenger now understood that their travel plans, their business meetings, their vacations were all hanging by a thread held in the hands of the two young men they had watched being scorned just minutes earlier. The silence was no longer awkward. It was the terrified hush of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Frank Gable stood frozen in the aisle, the dead phone still pressed to his ear as if hoping for a reprieve that would never come. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of terror. His crisp manager's uniform now seemed to hang on him like a shroud, his carefully constructed authority having evaporated into the recycled cabin air. Beside him, Karen Miller's perfect blonde bob was no longer perfect. Strands had come loose, and her face, moments ago a canvas of smug certainty, was now a crumbling ruin of disbelief and panic. She looked at the twins, her eyes wide with a dawning horror, as if seeing them for the first time not as interlopers, but as arbiters of her fate. With a monumental effort, Frank lowered the phone. His legs, which had carried him with blustering confidence just moments before, now trembled uncontrollably. He took a step towards Jordan and Jaden, then another. It was the walk of a condemned man, each step an agonizing journey towards his executioner. He didn't stop until he was directly in front of their seats, where the sheer weight of his professional and financial mortality finally crushed him. He collapsed to his knees in the aisle, the sound of his trousers hitting the carpet a dull, pathetic thud that echoed in the silent cabin. "Mr. Peterson," he began, his voice a ragged, strangled croak. He had to stop, swallow hard against the lump of terror in his throat, and start again. "Sirs, gentlemen, I have made a catastrophic, unforgivable error in judgment." His eyes, slick with a film of desperate sweat, darted between the two brothers. "There are no words, no excuses. What I did, my behavior, it was unprofessional, it was inexcusable, and it was fundamentally horribly wrong. I misjudged. I assumed." He couldn't finish the sentence, the ugly truth of his assumptions too damning to speak aloud. Karen, seeing her superior on his knees, was jolted into action. A guttural sob tore from her throat and she stumbled forward, nearly tripping over Frank's feet. She too fell to her knees, creating a bizarre, desperate tableau of supplication in the aisle. "Please," she wailed, the sound high and thin. Tears, genuine tears of pure, selfish fear, streamed down her cheeks, carving paths through her foundation. "Oh God, please, I'm so sorry. I'll lose my job. I have a mortgage. My son's tuition. I swear I don't know what I was thinking." Her apology was a chaotic torrent of personal consequences, a frantic attempt to find a sympathetic nerve. "I was just trying to follow procedure. Security protocols. They're so strict now. I thought—" Jordan held up a hand, his motion calm and deliberate. The effect was instantaneous. Karen's pleading choked off in her throat. He looked down at the two groveling figures, his expression not of anger, not of triumph, but of a profound and weary disappointment. "No, Miss Miller," he said, his voice level and hard as granite, cutting through her hysterics. "You were not following procedure. Let's be very clear about what happened here. Procedure is checking every passenger's ticket once. Procedure is a polite uniform greeting. What you did was an interrogation. You asked for our boarding passes twice. You demanded our government IDs and scrutinized them as if they were forgeries. You did this to no one else in this cabin. That isn't procedure. That's profiling." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. He then gestured with his head towards the ashen-faced Reginald Beaumont, who was trying to make himself invisible in seat 3C. "You then engaged in a non-verbal alliance with that man over there," Jordan continued, his voice like a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting every moment of their humiliation. "You shared a look, a smile, a silent agreement that we, the two black men in designer hoodies, were a problem, an anomaly in your pristine first-class world. You didn't see two ticketed passengers. You saw a threat to your perceived order, and every action you took was to validate that initial prejudiced judgment. The cabin was so quiet that the faint hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed deafening. Jordan leaned back, his part in the indictment finished. It was Jaden's turn. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze so intense it seemed to pin both Frank and Karen to the floor. "Your apology is meaningless," Jaden said, his voice quieter than his brother's but carrying an even greater weight. "Do you understand why? It's not for the disrespect. It's not for the humiliation you put us through in front of all these people. It's for the consequences. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry for who you did it to. You're terrified because the two young men you decided to bully for your own amusement happened to have a father who could hold you accountable in a way you never, ever imagined." He let that sink in, watching the flicker of recognition in their eyes that his words were the unvarnished truth. "This isn't just about a bad day at work for us, Mr. Gable," Jaden continued, his focus shifting to the manager. "This is the exhaustion of a lifetime. The exhaustion of having to be twice as good, twice as composed, just to be seen as legitimate. Of having to strategically calculate our outfits, our tone of voice, our very demeanor, just to navigate spaces where our presence is seen as a question mark. You weren't just trying to kick us off a plane. You were trying to remind us that, in your eyes, we don't belong. Your mistake wasn't a breach of protocol. It was a failure of basic human decency." As if on cue, Frank's phone buzzed violently on the floor where it had fallen. The screen lit up. Howard Davies, CEO. With a trembling hand, Frank retrieved it and answered, immediately pressing the speaker button as he had been instructed. "Gable, tell me you're fixing this." The CEO's voice crackled, no longer yelling but taut with a desperate urgency. There was a brief pause, and then the voice changed, adopting a strained, sycophantic tone. "Mr. Peterson? One of the Mr. Petersons? This is Howard Davies, the CEO of Transatlantic Air. I hope you can hear me. I am on the line, and I need to personally, on behalf of our entire global family, offer you and your brother my deepest, most sincere apologies. The behavior of my staff was abhorrent, unacceptable, and is in no way representative of our company's core values." Jaden let out a short, humorless laugh that made everyone in the cabin flinch. "Mr. Davies," he replied, his voice clear and resonant, easily picked up by the phone's microphone. "Your staff's behavior is your company's values until you prove otherwise. A company's values aren't what's written on a motivational poster in the break room. They are defined by the worst behavior you are willing to tolerate. And today your company tolerated bigotry. This wasn't an isolated incident by a couple of rogue employees. This was a symptom of a corporate culture that either actively encourages this kind of profiling, or at best, is completely indifferent to it. Which is it?" There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Howard Davies, a man used to controlling every conversation, was completely wrong-footed. I assure you we are not indifferent," he stammered. "We are taking immediate, decisive action. Mr. Gable and Miss Miller are, as of this moment, suspended indefinitely. Their employment will be terminated following the swiftest of investigations. What else, son? What else can we do to make this right? My entire fleet is bleeding money on the tarmac. I need you to tell me what you need." This was the moment of judgment. Jordan and Jaden exchanged a long, silent look. They were in complete sync. It wasn't about revenge. It was about rectification. "First," Jordan said, his voice ringing with authority, "we don't want anything for ourselves. Not a single dollar, not a flight voucher, not an upgrade. This isn't about compensation. This is about accountability." He then fixed his gaze on Reginald Beaumont. The portly man seemed to shrink under the attention, his face a blotchy patchwork of red and white. He nervously tugged at the collar of his tweed jacket, which suddenly seemed to be strangling him. "Second," Jordan continued, "your problem wasn't just with your employees, it was with your passengers. The man in seat 3C, Mr. Reginald Beaumont, was not a bystander. He was an enthusiastic co-conspirator. He egged on your flight attendant, validated her prejudice, and suggested we belonged on a bus. His presence made this aircraft a hostile environment. A company that values its customers should also value the safety and dignity of all its customers. Perhaps Transatlantic Air should reconsider its relationship with passengers who actively encourage the harassment of others. Through the phone, they could hear Howard Davies giving a muffled order to an aide. "Done," he said, his voice sharp and decisive. "Mr. Beaumont will be added to our permanent no-fly list before this call is over. He will never set foot on one of our aircraft again. What's next?" "A gesture of good faith," Jaden said. "A sign that you understand the systemic nature of this issue. We want Transatlantic Air to make a substantial 7-figure donation to the United Negro College Fund, not in our family's name. In the name of every person of color who has ever been made to feel unwelcome on one of your flights but didn't have the power to ground your fleet. This isn't a gift, it's a fine. It's a penance." Davies didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. You will have the receipt from our CFO within the hour. Please, I implore you. We have done everything you've asked. Ask your father to restore our system, please." The begging was over. The terms had been met. Jaden pulled out his own phone, the cabin watching his every move. He pressed Dad on his contacts list. The call was answered instantly. "Dad," Jaden said, his voice now gentle, the contrast with the preceding tension almost shocking. "It's handled. The CEO has agreed to all our terms. You can turn it back on." He listened for a moment, a faint smile touching his lips. "Yeah, we're okay. We'll see you in a few days. Love you." He hung up. No more than 30 seconds passed. Then the cabin lights, which had been running on auxiliary power, flickered once and then burned with a renewed, stable brightness. A series of soft chimes echoed through the plane as dormant systems rebooted. The pilot's voice, filled with a cocktail of sheer relief and utter disbelief, came crackling over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears the system is back online. All systems are green. We are being cleared by the tower for immediate departure." A scattered, nervous wave of applause broke out through the aircraft. But in first class, the only sound was the heavy, deliberate tread of 2 stern-faced airport security officers making their way up the aisle. They bypassed the passengers, their eyes fixed on the 2 kneeling figures. They stopped, looming over Karen Miller and Frank Gable. "Ma'am, sir," one of the officers said, his voice a flat, professional monotone that offered no comfort. "You need to come with us." Karen let out a final despairing wail as the officer gently but firmly took her by the arm and lifted her to her feet. Frank Gable rose silently, a hollowed-out man in a ruined suit. They were turned and escorted back down the aisle, the ultimate walk of shame, past the very men they had tried so arrogantly to eject. As they disappeared through the door of the jet bridge, the true karmic price of their prejudice had been paid in full, leaving a stunned and silent cabin to ponder the spectacular downfall they had just witnessed. The wheels of Transatlantic Air Flight 715 touched down on the tarmac at Heathrow with a gentle bump, a starkly normal end to the most abnormal flight in the airline's history. For most of the passengers, the 8-hour journey had been a surreal experience, a mix of high-altitude drama and the nervous, whispered retelling of the events that had transpired at the gate. But for the world outside the pressurized cabin, the story was just beginning its explosive ascent. Before the plane had even reached its cruising altitude, the first video clips had hit the internet. One was filmed by a business student in Seat 4A, another by a tech blogger in 5C. They captured everything. Karen Miller's condescending tone, Reginald Beaumont's booming interjections, Frank Gable's dismissive authority, and the unnerving, quiet calm of Jaden Peterson making that fateful call. By the time they landed, the internet had stitched the clips together, added captions, and given the saga a name that was already trending globally: #billionaires grounding. It was accompanied by other hashtags: #airline Karen, #first class takedown, and the more pointed #flying while black. The story spread with the ferocity of a digital wildfire. Tech journals were the first to connect the dots, identifying the twins and their legendary father, Robert Peterson. They explained the contractual kill switch, the Peterson Clause, turning a story about racial profiling into a jaw-dropping tale of corporate power dynamics and technological checkmates. From there, it was a feeding frenzy. Major news networks broke into their regular programming. Morning talk shows convened panels to discuss the ethics, the optics, and the sheer, delicious karma of it all. The incident was no longer a personal humiliation. It was a global case study in modern-day prejudice and its spectacular consequences. Inside the gleaming, glass-walled headquarters of Transatlantic Air, a Category 5 hurricane of panic was tearing through the executive floor. CEO Howard Davies, his face the color of ash, presided over an emergency damage control meeting that had been raging since the moment the system had come back online. The PR team presented horrifying metrics of negative sentiment. The legal team, having frantically reviewed the Orasync contract, confirmed the worst. Robert Peterson's actions had been entirely, devastatingly legal. The finance department was already calculating the initial losses from the 48-minute global shutdown, and the numbers were staggering. Upwards of $90 million in lost revenue, crew overtime, airport fees, and passenger rebookings, not to mention the immediate brutal hit the stock took in after-hours trading. "This isn't a fire," Davies barked, slamming his hand on the mahogany table. "This is a nuclear winter, and it was caused by 2 employees. 2. The decision was swift and merciless. Karen Miller and Frank Gable, who had been unceremoniously detained and questioned upon their removal from the plane, were fired via a cold, 2-sentence email. Their corporate access was revoked, their photos removed from the company intranet. They were, in effect, erased. Reginald Beaumont was more complicated. He was a customer, albeit a high-value one. The legal team advised caution, but Davies, seeing the video of Beaumont's sneering face looping on every news channel, overruled them. "He's radioactive," he declared. "He's the face of the entitled bigot we allowed to run our cabin. Ban him. Lifetime ban. And leak it to the press. We need to show we're cutting out the cancer." For the individuals at the heart of the storm, the karma was not a theoretical concept. It was a wrecking ball. Karen Miller arrived home to find her quiet suburban street clogged with news vans. Her phone had become a portal to hell, buzzing incessantly with hateful messages, threats, and notifications from thousands of strangers. She tried to delete her social media, but it was too late. Her photos, her family vacation pictures, her posts complaining about customers, it had all been screenshotted and was now being dissected by millions of digital vigilantes. She was no longer a person. She was Airline Karen, a meme, a cautionary tale. In the weeks that followed, she attempted to find new work. Her 2 decades of experience now rendered worthless. In one interview for a management position at a hotel chain, the hiring manager's eyes widened in recognition halfway through. You're the woman from the plane," he stammered. The interview ended abruptly. She discovered that her name was now inextricably linked with prejudice. Her professional life was over. In her darkest moments, alone in her home with the curtains drawn, she never once blamed her own actions. She blamed the twins for being arrogant, their father for his overreaction, and the woke mob for ruining her life. She was a victim of her own making, yet she saw herself as a victim of everyone else. Frank Gable's downfall was quieter but no less complete. He was not a public monster like Karen, but a private disgrace. He lost his substantial pension and severance package due to the gross misconduct clause in his contract. His wife looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. His children were embarrassed to talk about him. He had always seen himself as a man who followed the rules, who maintained order, but he was forced to confront the truth. He had not been maintaining order. He had been enforcing a pecking order. He had taken the easy path, siding with the person who looked like him, and in doing so, had enabled an injustice that had cost him everything. He spent his days in a forced retirement, the silence of his empty house a constant reminder of his professional and moral cowardice. Reginald Beaumont, a man who had built his life around the pillars of wealth, status, and respect, watched all 3 crumble in a single week. The news of his lifetime ban was just the beginning. The video of him goading Karen and sneering at the twins was toxic. His company, Beaumont Manufacturing, prided itself on its image as a legacy family values firm. Reginald's public behavior was a stain it could not afford. The board of directors, which included his own nephew, called an emergency meeting. It wasn't a discussion. It was an execution. They presented him with a pre-written letter of resignation from his role as chairman and a press release praising his decades of service. "You have to be joking," Reginald had sputtered. "I built this company." His nephew, a man he had mentored, looked at him with cold, pragmatic eyes. "Reggie, it's not about that anymore. Omnicorp just terminated their contract. $30 million a year. Their CEO's wife is on the board of a diversity initiative. They said, and I quote, 'We cannot be in business with a company whose leadership finds public racism acceptable. You've become a liability. It's over.'" Stripped of his corporate title, Reginald found his social standing evaporated as well. Invitations to charity galas dried up. His calls to fellow titans of industry went to voicemail. He was shunned at his country club, the polite nods replaced with averted eyes. He had eagerly participated in the public shaming of two young men, and his punishment was a permanent public shaming of his own. Meanwhile, in London, Jordan and Jaden Peterson watched the global firestorm with a sense of weary detachment. They coolly and professionally closed the expansion deal for their startup, their focus absolute. They were business leaders after all, but the world wanted them to be something more. Spokesmen, activists, symbols. They turned down dozens of offers from high-profile TV shows. Instead, they agreed to a single, long-form interview with a respected journalist, known for her nuanced work on race and technology. In the interview, they were not triumphant or vengeful. They were thoughtful and incisive. "The story isn't that we won," Jaden explained, his voice calm and measured. "The story is that we had to possess an almost cartoonish level of privilege to achieve a simple, basic outcome, the right to sit in a seat we paid for. The real issue is what happens to the black man, or woman or child who gets harassed on a plane and doesn't have a father who can shut down the airline. They are quietly removed, humiliated, and their story is never told. That's the reality we need to address." Their father, Robert Peterson, worked in the way he always had, not with words but with code and contracts. He saw the incident not just as a personal affront, but as a systemic failure. His response was systemic. He instructed the formidable legal team at Aura Sync to redraft their master service agreement. The new version included what the industry press immediately dubbed the Peterson Clause 2.0. It was an expansion of the original. Any client whose company was found through either legal proceedings or credible public evidence to have engaged in discriminatory practices against customers or employees could have their Aura Sync services suspended or terminated. It was a revolution disguised as boilerplate. Aura Sync software was the digital backbone for hundreds of Fortune 500 companies, banks, logistics empires, retail giants. Robert Peterson had just made diversity and inclusion a matter of contractual life or death. Corporate DEI initiatives, long criticized as toothless PR, suddenly had very sharp, multi-billion-dollar teeth. The Peterson family never sought further retribution. They had already achieved it. Jordan and Jaden's company flourished, becoming a testament to their brilliance and resilience. Robert Peterson continued to run his empire, a quiet force reshaping the corporate world. The names Karen Miller, Frank Gable, and Reginald Beaumont faded into the footnotes of a viral news cycle, their lives forever defined by a single catastrophic failure of character. The story of Flight 715 became a legend in the business world, a brutal, unforgettable lesson that in the modern age, the person you dismissively stereotype might just be the one with a direct line to the person who can turn off your world. As the cabin door hissed shut and the jet bridge retracted, a profound and deeply uncomfortable silence settled over the first-class cabin of Flight 715. The raw, high-stakes drama had concluded, leaving behind a vacuum filled with shame, awkwardness, and the quiet hum of the Rolls-Royce engines spooling up for takeoff. The remaining passengers, who had been rapt observers, now seemed unsure of where to look. They were acutely aware that they were locked in a metal tube for the next 8 hours with the two young men who had just demonstrated a truly terrifying level of influence. A new flight attendant, a younger woman with wide, nervous eyes, came to the front cabin. She had clearly been briefed on the situation, and she approached Jordan and Jaden's seats with the trepidation of someone handling unexploded ordnance. "Mr. Petersons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Maria. I'll be taking over service for your flight. Can I get you anything at all? Champagne? A warm towel? Anything you desire?" "Just some water, please, Maria." "Thank you," Jordan replied, his tone gentle and reassuring. He could see the fear in her eyes and made a conscious effort to dispel it. They were not monsters. They were men who had simply demanded to be treated with respect. For the rest of the flight, the brothers were treated with a level of deferential reverence usually reserved for royalty. Every request was met instantly. Every passing crew member offered a quiet, respectful nod. The other passengers gave them a wide berth, their earlier curiosity now replaced by a mixture of awe and intimidation. The most striking transformation, however, was in Reginald Beaumont. He sat hunched in his seat, a shrunken, pathetic figure. The boisterous contempt was gone, replaced by a palpable aura of dread. He didn't order a drink. He didn't eat his meal. He stared blankly at the screen in front of him, though it was clear he wasn't watching anything. He was a man marinating in the consequences of his own hubris. Once he tried to catch Jordan's eye, perhaps to offer a desperate, unspoken apology. But Jordan's gaze was cool and impenetrable. There would be no absolution for him at 30,000 feet. For Reginald Beaumont, the flight to London was the longest and loneliest journey of his life. Upon landing at Heathrow, the story had already metastasized across the globe. As Jordan and Jaden stepped into the arrivals hall, their phones lit up with notifications from news alerts and messages from stunned friends and colleagues. They ignored them. With the same quiet focus they had maintained throughout the ordeal, they were met by a prearranged car and whisked away to their hotel to prepare for the meetings that were the entire purpose of their trip. They had not started this war, but having been forced to finish it, they refused to let it derail their ambitions. The true lasting karma, however, was just beginning to ripple outwards, devastating the lives of those who had instigated the conflict. Reginald Beaumont's reckoning came swiftly. After clearing customs, he went to the transatlantic air ticket counter to confirm his return flight, only to be met with a polite but firm refusal. The agent couldn't even find his name in the system. A frantic call to his personal travel agent confirmed the unbelievable truth. He had a lifetime ban. As he stood, stranded and sputtering in the terminal, a notification popped up on his phone. It was a press release from his own company. The board had voted unanimously to accept his immediate resignation as chairman. His nephew had not even afforded him the courtesy of a phone call. He was alone, an ocean away from home, stripped of his power, his reputation, and even his ability to fly on his preferred airline. The man who had sneered that the twins belonged on a bus was now forced to scramble for a last-minute seat on a rival carrier, a humiliating journey home to a life that had been irrevocably diminished. For Karen Miller and Frank Gable, there was no escape. They became the faces of corporate prejudice in the digital age. HR departments at other airlines immediately blacklisted them. Their LinkedIn profiles became memorials to their dead careers. Frank, stripped of his pension, was forced to sell his home and downsize, the financial ruin a constant grinding reminder of his moral failure. Karen tried to rebrand herself, to write a blog post about being a victim of cancel culture, but the public had no sympathy. The videos were too clear, her condescension too raw. She was a pariah, a living embodiment of a particular brand of entitled bigotry, forever defined by the worst 30 minutes of her life. Transatlantic Air bled for months. The $90 million loss from the shutdown was just the start. They faced a shareholder lawsuit for the stock dip and the gross mismanagement of a critical business partnership. CEO Howard Davies, to save his own skin, initiated a top-to-bottom overhaul of the company's culture. He hired a prestigious diversity and inclusion consultancy and poured tens of millions into mandatory, company-wide anti-bias and de-escalation training. New, ruthlessly strict protocols were implemented. Flight attendants were retrained to understand that their job was service, not security, that their authority was a responsibility, not a weapon. The story of Flight 715 became the central case study in their training modules, a terrifying example of how individual prejudice could bring a global corporation to its knees. But the most profound change was the one orchestrated by Robert Peterson. The Peterson Clause 2.0 inches was a quiet revolution. When it was discovered by a legal journal, it sent shockwaves through the corporate world. It made good ethics a non-negotiable part of the digital infrastructure of modern business. Companies using Aura Sync software, which was nearly everyone, were now contractually obligated to police their own cultures. An executive at a major bank was overheard saying, "We're more afraid of an ethics violation than a market crash now. One loses you money, the other could lose you your entire operating system." Robert Peterson had weaponized accountability. Weeks later, having successfully secured the largest international deal in their company's history, Jordan and Jaden returned home. They had navigated a media firestorm and a high-stakes business negotiation with a maturity that belied their years. They never spoke publicly about the incident again. Instead, they took a portion of their company's newfound profits and launched the Peterson Ascend Initiative, a foundation dedicated to providing seed funding and mentorship to minority entrepreneurs. Their mission was simple and clear, born from their experience on Flight 715. As Jaden explained to their first cohort of young founders, "The world is full of doors that will be closed to you because of how you look. We want to give you the resources to build your own door, one so strong and so significant that no one ever dares to shut it in your face. We were lucky. We had a key that could blow the whole building down. Our goal is to make sure you won't need one." The echoes of that day on Flight 715 never truly faded. It became a modern parable about power, prejudice, and the unforeseen consequences of underestimating someone. It served as a stark reminder that in a world woven together by technology and commerce, the old hierarchies were more fragile than they appeared. A single act of bigotry, aimed at the wrong people at the wrong time, had not just ruined a few careers. It had grounded a fleet, rewritten corporate law, and set a new, unyielding standard for justice in an interconnected age. The karma had not just been a satisfying moment of revenge, it had become a lasting, structural legacy. And that's the incredible story of how a moment of ugly prejudice in a first-class cabin led to a global corporate shutdown. It's a powerful reminder that the true measure of a person is their character, not the clothes they wear or the color of their skin. Jordan and Jaden Peterson weren't looking for a fight, but when faced with blatant disrespect, they were fortunate enough to have a recourse most people only dream of. The karma that hit Karen Miller, Frank Gable, and Reginald Beaumont was swift, precise, and devastating, a direct consequence of their own arrogance. This story shows that while injustice and prejudice still exist, sometimes, just sometimes, the scales of justice balance out in the most spectacular way imaginable. What did you think of this incredible turn of events? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karmic justice, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama. Thanks for listening.